Thank you all for joining. This is so exciting. I see we've got almost 135 people in the middle of an afternoon on a Wednesday, I believe. So fantastic that you're able to free up some work, presumably work time to attend this. We're delighted to have you here. Very pleased with partnering on with the Canadian Mental Health Association and Safe Care BC to help deliver this session. And I have to say, just before I get started, I'm a medical physician by trade, and I am absolutely indebted and very, very appreciative of all the work that you folks do for our patients and our patient communities and their family members and so forth. I don't have the patience or the skills to do what you do, so I'm always grateful for the impressive work that you do, and always envious of how well you deliver the services that you do. So thank you very much for all the great work that you do. I think I've been introduced already. So I'm a family physician, was sort of my original training, but my entire practice, I'm an occupational medicine physician, a disability medicine physician. So I've really been helping people with disabilities for the bulk and majority of my career. We started the ADHD centers about 12, 13 years ago, recognizing that, especially with adults, there weren't a lot of places that adults could affordably and easily access ADHD assessments. So we started, and I only work in the public system with MSP and in the universal healthcare system. So I started doing ADHD assessments and ADHD care. And probably in any given day, including today, I'll probably diagnose and treat up to 15 or 20 patients, adults with ADHD. But we recognized there was a need, and so we expanded our services to every province and every territory. And I'm very pleased to say that we're over about 35,000 assessments for ADHD across Canada and every territory and every province from coast to coast to coast. And the most recent labor of love has been we launched the Adult Autism Center just last year. And so you can see our centers there, the adult ADHD centers in the upper right. That's what we started with. And I think these QR codes will take you right to the website if you need to reach them. The Adult Autism Center for adults who have not been assessed or managed and would like to know if they're autistic is what we launched in the last year, and that's been incredibly satisfying work. The other Dr. Parhar Anita and her women thought leaders from across the country launched the ADHD Center for Women, recognizing that women's journey through ADHD is quite different than what boys and men go through. And if you're ever interested, she would probably be pleased to come and give a presentation on just that topic, just because it's such an important topic. And then we have our own disability team where we help people advocate for disability tax credits and Canadian pension plan disabilities programs and a long-term disability if they're needing some help around the medical portions of those. So those are our centers. Just a quick point about our centers. There's sort of three pillars. One is the clinical care and the assessments, which we're heavily involved with. Like I said, over 35,000 across the country. Then we do a lot of education to the public, to health professionals, basically anyone that'll listen. We were just in Kamloops last week to give presentations to elementary and high school educators on ADHD and autism. So we do that, and want to thank the organization that we're partnering with today, Canadian Mental Health, for being partners with us to help us meet that education mandate. And third is we do research. So we do a lot of international studies looking at different treatments for ADHD, which ones work, which ones don't, and looking at coexisting conditions with ADHD. And that research has been published, and we're still working on that as well. So a few disclosures, because I'm a clinical professor at UBC, I always have to put up a slide like this. In the past, my research has been supported by companies that make medications for ADHD. In the past, I have been paid to speak on behalf of these companies, and I've been paid some consulting fees. None of that is impacting anything we're talking about today. There's absolutely no funding for today's presentation that I'm receiving, and the content is entirely my own. Everything I share will be what we call evidence-based or research-based. If there's ever an opportunity for me to share something that's my opinion, I will say that in the beginning. My opinion, I believe this, but otherwise it'll be everything I share will be research and published in what we call peer-reviewed, meaning that people have reviewed it and it's been improved. We belong to an organization called CADRA, CADDRA. If you're looking for a resource for professionals, that organization determines how ADHD is screened for, diagnosed, and treated in Canada. And that's really what we follow are those clinical practice guidelines. So just to remind everyone, as much as I'd love it if you got really confident about knowing about ADHD after today's session, remember that today's session is really just for educational purposes. And really, please don't stop, start, or change anyone's treatment, whether it's yourselves or loved ones, whether it's a medication treatment or a non-medication treatment, without the supervision and guidance of their healthcare professional. So please don't be adjusting anyone's treatment or think you can adjust your own without the supervision of that of your physician, your nurse practitioner, your registered clinical counselor, your psychologist, whoever's helping you with or your loved one with ADHD. So, a couple of things. Chris kindly said that we will be sharing a copy of the slide deck. And as you've probably figured out, I speak very fast. My medical students often joke that I'm an auctioneer in the evenings. I'm not an auctioneer, but although that would have been a nice side trade. But I do speak fairly fast. But please don't stress about doing screenshots on these slides. We'll provide you a copy of the entire deck. And likewise, try not to feel like you have to frantically write stuff down. Just sit back, enjoy the content, and we promise we'll get you a copy of the slide deck. Okay. So what we're hoping to cover in today's session is what ADHD is, and then more broadly, what is neurodiversity? Everyone's talking about neurodiversity these days, and I have to admit, it wasn't a term I'd even heard 2 or 3 years ago. So what are we talking about when we say neurodiversity, and what is ADHD? Looking at some of the behaviors, you notice I'm not using the word symptoms here, but some of the behaviors associated with ADHD, and then how those behaviors or those symptoms, if you want to call it that, might manifest and affect someone's functioning in the workplace. And then let's talk about some strategies and approaches to support employees with ADHD. What can managers do? I know some of you attending today are in management or supervisory type roles or leads or team leads. What can you do when you have a team member who has ADHD? And then we'll leave you with some resources so you have some places to look up things. So when we're talking about neurodiversity, it really covers a lot of things, whether you want to call it an umbrella or you want to call it a tent. Under the umbrella or tent of neurodiversity, it's ADHD, which we're going to focus on today. But there's also autism, there's Down syndrome, there's the inability to or challenges with doing math, which we call dyscalculia, difficulty with writing, letters or numbers that are switched to get switched, like what we often call dyslexia. Sometimes people include bipolar, obsessive compulsive disorders, social anxieties, and a bunch of other things that fit under neurodiversity. So if we think of things that way, then is neurodiversity or is one of these conditions even a disability? So many people who are neurodivergent will say that they disagree with that. They feel that their brain is just different and they shouldn't be seen as someone with a disability. Now, the problem there's pros and cons to this, right, is that at the end of the day, these conditions can be quite problematic or challenging for people. And from that perspective, yes, they are technically disabling them from doing things, and they could be seen as a disability. Now, if the person themselves says, no, that my neurodiverse condition and what makes me neurodivergent is my superpower, it's what makes me amazing, more power to you. I'm totally in support of you saying that. But it's not my place to say that any of these conditions shouldn't give you a superpower. And it's not my place to say that these aren't disabling, because for some people they can be. And so when we think about neurodiversity, what we're really saying is it's a different way of being. And some of that different way of being might be totally fine and not disabling someone from the activities they want to do. And for other people, it could be. So that's why we have this sort of discussion on neurodiversity being a disability. And the idea in the term neurodiversity is that everyone has a brain that's different. There isn't such a thing as a normal and an abnormal. Judy Singer was probably the first person in 1998 who termed this, is that everyone is unique, everyone's brain is different. So there's what we call normal variations in the population. And really what we should be talking about are what we call the strength-based approach, which is that, yes, you could have challenges in some areas of your brain functioning, but then you might be better in other areas. So let's not always focus on the negative and the deficits and the challenges. Let's also talk about the strengths at the same time. And like I said, there's varying viewpoints on this in the neurodivergent community. Some people see it as a source of strength, others are struggling with it. And what's really important is that we let people who are neurodivergent then use it as a source of empowerment different if they can. Language is really important. And you're all in healthcare, so you understand this, is when we use labels or we give diagnoses, it's often helpful because it opens up resources, might open up treatment options, may help accommodate things at home or in school or in work. So we need sometimes a label or a diagnosis, but be careful that we're not then making that person feel like they're sick or defective or abnormal and holding them back from their careers. So specifically, that was just generally about neurodiversity, but let's just now focus on one aspect of neurodiversity, which is ADHD. So people think that this is something new, right? It just sort of, cropped up in the last couple of years and it was non-existent before. Well, that's not true. We've been talking about this for many, many years, and since the 1700s. There's even a nursery rhyme. Is the nursery rhyme? You'll see Phil here. Phil's the child in the red outfit. So fidgety Phil, who couldn't sit still. I won't. Don't get worried. I'm not going to read you we're not going to recite the rest of the rhyme, but it's fidgety Phil who couldn't sit still. So there's even nursery rhymes about this, right? But what did that do was that a fidgety Phil who couldn't sit still put stereotypes in our minds about who fidgety Phil and who were people with ADHD. They were children. They were usually white boys. Right. And so even in the medical community, there was these stereotypes of who had ADHD. There were little white boys who had ADHD. And what that meant, unfortunately, is that as physicians, as healthcare providers and as health professionals, we overlooked other people who were struggling with their ADHD, either because they were a little girl or female, they were not white, or they were older and an adult. So that means if you've gone to your health professional, whether they're a counselor, they're a physician or a psychologist, and they've overlooked or missed your ADHD, it's because we weren't thoroughly trained in this many years ago. And originally in 1902, it was described very much as a deficit, sometimes even in moral control. And you'll know in the 80s and so forth, we started calling it ADD. And the reason some people called it ADD, you'll remember, we try not to use that term, is that people were really keen on not emphasizing or not have it be known that they had the H. So they were okay saying they had attention deficit disorder, but they didn't really want people to think they had the H. The hyperactivity, even though all mental health, as we know, has stigma, social stigma, then ADHD has stigma. There was a thinking that the H part, the hyperactivity part, had the most stigma with it. So people were careful to say, hey, I don't have ADHD, I have ADD, because they were afraid of how people might perceive them if they were seen to be hyperactive or impulsive. Right. But really, their ADD is not a thing. When you're thinking about ADHD, it falls into sort of three groupings of symptoms. We try not to use the word type. They're not three types of ADHD, just three groupings of symptoms. You can have ADHD where people are primarily having problems with attention. So problems with attention, focus, not getting distracted easily. That's one group of symptoms. One group of symptoms is where people are hyperactive. So they can't sit still. They might be physically hyperactive, or they might be impulsively doing things. They might be impatient. They might be restless. Right. So that's the ADHD H part. And then the combined means someone has both. So they have the inattention and they have the hyperactivity. So we call that combined. So there's sort of three groupings of ADHD: ADHD inattentive, ADHD hyperactive, and ADHD combined. Now, ADHD inattentive is really what people meant by ADD. So ADD, another way of saying what the proper term for ADD is, it's ADHD inattentive. The other important things, we know that it's a neurodevelopmental condition, meaning that people typically are born with it and it shows up in childhood. So it's really difficult for us to diagnose someone in adulthood if they didn't have childhood symptoms. There's often symptoms of all of this, and we're going to go through the symptoms in a bit. We're going to talk about work mostly today, but just to understand that it impacts all parts of life, not just work, but school, home life, relationships, a lot of different things. I was lucky enough to see Stephen Nelson in action, but it was really interesting, and he sticks out in my mind. He says, this is his quote, he says, I practice a lot. He's a musician. He says, and when I was playing the cello or learning the cello, I practiced a lot, but I had to practice twice as hard to get half as much accomplished. And what we often talk about here is that ADHD aren't people who aren't motivated. In fact, they're really motivated. Most of the time, they're putting in extra effort to get things accomplished. They just aren't succeeding as much with that, even with that extra effort. One cool thing about Stephen is that when he was learning his cello, He was also learning other instruments like drums, guitar, and a piano. So one of his claims to fame now is that he plays a cello in a way that no one else does. He actually strums it, like normally you play it with the bow. He strums it, he bangs it, and he plucks the strings. And he's the only cellist who actually uses a kick drum. But just to say that some of his ADHD, because he couldn't keep his attention on the cello, forced him to start looking at other instruments. But he was in a unique position where he actually combined a lot of his gifts together. Now, going back to, everyone's talking about it now. Well, exactly how common is ADHD? And really what we understand, and there's some debate around these numbers, but for adults with ADHD, we think it's about 5%. And why am I sharing this number with you? Is that it's fairly common. When you think about mood disorders like depression, it's about 5.4%. So it's not a lot less common than depression. And depression is fairly common in the population. So when you say 5%, let's just convert that to a fraction, just because it's easier sometimes as a fraction. 5% is 1 in 20. So that means that if you're in a workplace with 20 people, one of those people is going to have ADHD. If you have 40 clients in your practice or in your ward or in your clinic, and of those 40, two probably will have ADHD. So another way to say this is that it's not rare. This is not something that's rare. If you have you have ADHD yourself, you have a loved one, a family member with ADHD, your partner has ADHD, a coworker does, or a friend does, we probably all do. We probably all know someone with ADHD. Now, the important thing, like I said, is that people are born with ADHD. We've actually identified the genes that are associated with ADHD, and we've identified a familial pattern. I won't bore you with the stats, but if a parent has ADHD, it's about 50% likelihood that one of their children will have it. If a child has ADHD, it's 50% likely that one of their parents has it. And if one child has ADHD, it's 30% likely that one of their siblings will have it. So we know that there's a genetic component there. Most of the symptoms will be really prominent by the age of 12. We used to say 7, but now it's by the age of 12. So if you think about our Canadian education system, age 12 is usually by the end of grade 7, a little bit different for everyone, but usually it's about grade 7 before grade 8, right? And if it's grade 8's high school, it's usually at the end of elementary school if you don't have a middle school system. So usually it's by grade 7. So when we're asking people about their childhood symptoms, I'll often ask what they were like before they started elementary school, but then kindergarten to about grade 3, and then grade 4 to grade 7. Now, I still want to know about high school. I still want to know about adult life, and I want to know about university, college, what they're like in their work life. But I'm really focus in on what they were like in elementary school because I need to see some symptoms in those teenage years. And that's not always easy because we only see adults. Sometimes if you're like me and you're 56 years old, it's hard to remember what you did for breakfast this morning, much less what you did how you were when you were, 11 or 12 years old. So it's hard sometimes to think back then. So we're often asking people to check their childhood report cards, ask their parents and others around them what they were like when they were younger. I always put up this slide when we diagnose someone with ADHD just to emphasize that this isn't just something made up. This isn't too much screen time. It's not just too much, it's not just a millennial condition. It's not bad parenting. These aren't people who are just lazy and not motivated. There is a biological difference in the brain of someone with ADHD and someone without ADHD. You notice I'm not saying normal because if we use the neurodiversity philosophy, there is no such thing as normal and abnormal, right? There's the ADHD brain and then there's the non-ADHD brain, not a normal brain. But anyway, the difference between the ADHD and the non-ADHD brain on this PET scan, hope you can appreciate, is a different level of activity going on in the brain. So if you look carefully, you can see how if you think of the orange as being activity, a lot less orange in the ADHD brain. But if you think of the pink as being some less activity, there's some areas of the brain of the ADHD which is actually more active than parts of the non-ADHD brain. So what we think is going on is that there's a difference in what we call dopamine and norepinephrine. These are messengers that need to go between the brain cells, and we think there is a difference in how well those connections work in the ADHD brain. And that's why when we use medications, happy to come back to do a whole talk on medications for ADHD if that's of interest to you. But that's how the medicines for ADHD work, is they increase dopamine and norepinephrine, so there's better connection between the brain cells. Now, we've also found that brains of people with ADHD can be smaller, they have a different thickness. Not sure how important that is. I'm not sure if that even affects someone's functioning. That's why we don't spend a lot of time on that. But we do spend a lot of time talking about dopamine and norepinephrine because that's something we can fix. Now, you probably know this already, but I'm just going to quickly remind us of the symptoms, or I said I wouldn't call them symptoms, or behaviors around ADHD. Some of these will be familiar to you, but just so we're all on the same page. People with ADHD tend to not always listen when they're spoken to directly. And some of this is going to be really relevant when we're talking about the impact on the workplace. They get easily distracted, and those distractions might be external things, so shiny things or things that pop up in their environment around them, or there might be internal distractions, so things that pop into their brain, and now they got to go look it up or do something about it. They don't always follow through on instructions or complete tasks. They have a hard time starting tasks and finishing them. They often fidget, right? So I've got my pen here. I might be fidgeting, I might be playing with my glasses. Might be not be able to sit still. So they're often physically hyperactive. They get impatient, right? They'll road rage speed. They have a hard time waiting their turn in line. Difficulty focusing, make careless mistakes, end up sending that email before checking it all. Difficulty organizing things, their bedroom, their workspace, maybe just, organized chaos at best. Already said, unable to sit still. They may be the person who can't sit still in a meeting and then have to stand up and, say they've got a bad back. Maybe they do have a bad back, or maybe it's ADHD and they just couldn't sit still. They often talk a lot, a bit like I'm doing now, but they'll talk a lot and they'll often interrupt people, or they'll blurt out stuff before it's their turn. They forget to do things, and this may seem really basic, but if they weren't reminded, a lot of people with ADHD would forget to brush their teeth, or take a shower, or floss, or buy grocery, or cook, or vacuum, or do laundry. Right? Do dishes. So they can be quite forgetful. And I could list more and more for you, but these are some of the more common manifestations. What we think is happening with ADHD is we think there's a problem with what we call executive functioning. Again, a term that people and I didn't know about 2 years ago. It's actually kind of funny when I saw someone yesterday, a young adult, she's in secondary school, and I said, so what can I help you with? I was for an ADHD assessment. And she goes, Dr. Parr, I'm having problems with my executive functioning. And it was interesting, 3 or 4 years ago, I don't think anyone would have come to me saying, I'm having problems with my executive functioning. So of course I had to ask her, I said, I need to know what you mean by that. What do you mean by executive functioning? And really what she meant is she has problems with judgment, problem solving, forward thinking, some social behaviors and so forth. We know that ADHD affects the whole brain, but it definitely affects what we call the frontal and prefrontal cortex, where some of those things that are really important are there. The attention, when we pay attention to things, our behavior and judgment, our emotional responses. In a moment, I'm going to show you a slide that speaks about emotional responses. And if you think about it, if the front part of the brain is affected in ADHD, of course, emotional responses will be affected in ADHD. If you think about the brain and the executive function, think about it like the CEO, right? It's sort of where all the high level stuff happens. And we think ADHD affects us. I won't bore you with reading all this slide, but just to say, we know that it's problems with all these different areas. One of the challenges with ADHD is that I've seen thousands of patients, and in all our centers combined, we've, as a group, seen more than 35,000 patients. I've yet to see two people that are the same with their ADHD. Just to say that everyone with ADHD is quite unique. So even though you're attending a session like today, don't please extrapolate from that you now know how everyone with ADHD is like. It can be quite different. When you're understanding ADHD, we all need to really come from a place of empathy, that people with ADHD are all quite unique, that they're quite individual, and don't assume or make assumptions about people. So this slide's kind of important to think about how it happens as someone gets older. So I know it looks like a whole bunch of spaghetti, but let me explain it. It's not that complicated. So in the bottom arrow, it just shows as someone gets older. So you go from childhood to being a teenager to being an adult. So as someone gets older, their ADHD, that's attention, that's the turquoise arrow at the top, continues. That means someone's problems with attention and focus continue from childhood years to teenage years to adult years. So their attention problems continue. As they get older, the blue line there is impulsive behaviors. Their impulsive behaviors tend to go down as they get older. And so what this means is if someone was otherwise going to binge drink, binge shop, binge, gamble, or do something impulsively, that tends to go down. Now, this is my theory on this, is the reason it goes down as people get older is that we start to realize as we get older that there's consequences to those impulsive behaviors. If I impulsively buy something, I'm going to have to deal with the credit card bill. If I drink too much, I'm going to have to then go around and apologize to people that I said silly things to because I had drank too much. So people start realizing there's consequences to their impulsive behavior. So they try to control them as they get older. The physical hyperactivity or the restlessness tends to go down as people get older as well. And part of that is, I think, is my theory on this, is I think it's not socially acceptable. If I was, bouncing around with my pen or fiddling with my glasses, Carissa would probably private message me and say, Gertie, could you sit still a little bit? All you moving around and everything is kind of distracting the listeners or the attendees of the session. So I think it's not okay. I remember talking to a young woman saying, are you physically hyperactive? Like, do you move around and stuff? You seem pretty calm. And she goes, Dr. Parhar, I'm sitting on my hands right now because otherwise I would be flapping my hands all over the place. So people do still get the urges to be physically hyperactive, but it is under sort of better control or they try to control it as they get older. But here's the important part. As you get older, what we call the coexisting conditions with ADHD actually go up. Now, what we mean by that is when we see people as adults, their ADHD now isn't just ADHD. They'll have ADHD and depression. They'll have ADHD and anxiety. They'll have ADHD and a substance use disorder. They'll have ADHD and a sleep disorder, ADHD and an eating disorder. So often they have a coexisting condition, which in childhood you're going to see less of, but you're going to see more as an adult. So, and I won't go into the details here. It'll be on the slide deck if you're asking for it. But just to tell you that there's a lot of conditions that can coexist with ADHD. Our phrase is that ADHD rarely travels alone in adults. There's a lot of co-occurring things that travel with it. So a few misconceptions before we dive into the work stuff. One is that don't assume people with ADHD are unorganized, unintelligent, or lazy. One of the regrets I have around my ADHD work is that we started our centers 13 years ago. I wish we had started doing IQ tests and when we were doing ADHD assessments, we just never started doing them. The research shows that that the average IQ, so how intelligent someone is, for people with ADHD is the same as people without ADHD. So I'll say that again. People with ADHD have the same average IQ as people without ADHD. So they're not any smarter or less smart. My belief is that people with ADHD actually have a higher IQ than the rest of us mortals. I actually think that people with ADHD get missed as kids because things came easy to them. I don't have the research to support that. The research is showing that the IQ is about the same. Also, be careful if you're working with or you have a loved one with ADHD that you don't get too superficial about it. Like, in a way, I'm happy that ADHD is being covered more in social media and sitcoms and stand-up comedians are talking about it, but I'm also a little bit irritated that people are making light of it. Everyone has a little bit of ADHD, or that was an ADHD moment. No, either have ADHD or you don't. It's a bit like being pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. Now, you can't have a bit of ADHD. Either you meet the criteria and have ADHD or you don't. How it affects you can vary. There's some people who have ADHD and it's not impacting their work in a significant way or their home or their schooling because they've managed to figure out ways to deal with it. Other people are probably crashing and burning and it's affecting them a lot. So be careful with that little bit of ADHD. Everyone forgets where they parked their car and lost their keys. That's not ADHD. And then the comment about you're too smart, you're too successful to have ADHD. I haven't yet to find a profession in which people don't have ADHD. So it's not overdiagnosed. A lot of people were being missed, and we really need to remove those ADHD misconceptions. And at the end of the day, a lot of times people with ADHD aren't always deficient in attention, but the attention isn't on the right thing. I had this fellow who came in a couple of months ago that said, Dr. Parhar, I wish you would go back in a time machine and change the name. I don't like he has ADHD. He says, I don't like the term attention deficit. He goes, I don't have any deficit of attention. I've got lots of attention. It's just on the wrong things at the wrong times, right? So we have to really watch that. Unfortunately, I can't change the name of it. I wish I could. A few things before we dive into the workplace stuff is that we know that there's a lot of different ways that people with ADHD show up. We talked about executive functioning. I won't repeat that, but dysregulation. A lot of times people with ADHD have really strong emotions that they can't control. Right? Self-regulating themselves, which may be important in an employee-employer relationship when their manager or someone says something to them. Are they having difficulty self-regulating? Sensory processing, so ability to take sounds in and be able to process them. This idea of time blindness can be really important in the workplace, which is not appreciating how long something will take to get done and then overcommitting, saying, yes, I'll do it, and then realizing that's just too much. It's not humanly possible to do all that. Working memory, thinking that you're going to keep stuff in your memory and be able to retrieve it and not be able to retrieve it. Rejection sensitivity dysphoria, again, something new that I hadn't even heard of before. And the idea here is that when someone is given feedback, and particularly critical or negative feedback, they see it as a rejection, and they'll have a reaction to that. Often what we call rejection sensitivity dysphoria, or a huge reaction to that kind of feedback. So that's also part of ADHD. A lot of times, and we're seeing more and more of this, is that people with ADHD in a workplace can have what we call a justice sensitivity. I had a person recently say, she doesn't get bothered when people are being mean to her or unfair to her, but if she sees that someone else is being treated unfairly, she can't control herself. Her boss and her supervisor say, just let it go, just let it go. Why are you letting it consume you? But she can't let it go. She has to go and help and intervene. And so a lot of times, your coworkers or people with ADHD will have this justice sensitivity where they react to things. So, focusing now on the workplace and ADHD, we understand that ADHD is a risk factor for unemployment or underemployment. I think we all know what unemployment is. It's when you're not working. Underemployment means that people with ADHD may not be working full time, may be working part time. They may earn less than their peers without ADHD. They have a higher risk of getting fired or dismissed. They may quit their job before they have another one. They may not have great relationships with their colleagues. And somebody smarter than me estimated that ADHD probably cost the Canadian economy $6 to $11 billion a year. Now, it's not perhaps not easy, but it's common to think about these things that are challenges with ADHD in the workplace, which is the topic of today's session. Time management, we've kind of spoken about, especially on time blindness, forgetting or not being properly prepared for meetings, not being able to delegate tasks, being disorganized, not being able to start. There's something called decision paralysis, which is you got to do something and you got to start, but just not being able to start because you can't make that first decision. Hard to pay attention and follow through, overlooking details, difficulty with paperwork. A lot of times people, especially in our health professions, are great at the performance, right? We're great when we're with our patients or our clients because that's why we love our work. We love working with them. We love interacting with them. But then having to write those notes after or do the invoicing or read something in preparation for it or document stuff, right? Or order supplies or do scheduling. Not as exciting for most of us, right? So we often get behind in paperwork. Making an impulsive comment is part of ADHD, and that can be harmful to a coworker or to a client. Being restless and so forth. So these are some of the challenges. Before we start honing in on the challenges and how to improve them, I also want to leave you with, remember we said neurodiversity is also about strengths, is that people with ADHD are a blessing in the workplace, right? There's a lot of stuff they do that the rest of us don't do. People with ADHD often are more innovative. They think differently because their brains are different. They can solve problems that the rest of us can't. They enhance team dynamics. They're a lot of fun and charismatic and energetic. They can actually increase productivity, sometimes by hyperfocusing, which isn't always healthy, but doing it for little spurts of time might actually help. They improve market competitiveness because they'll, again, think of things and move the team forward when the team wouldn't be moving forward. And it adds to social sort of responsibility. And I think that when we think about neurodiverse individuals, it's probably about 20% where ADHD is 5%. This is more for employers, but just to think about in terms of inclusion, when we include, my previous life was in equity and diversity and inclusion at the university and other places. And so this is sort of my DNA around making sure that our workplaces are diverse. People of different genders and abilities and ethnicities and how we work them in really does help everyone at a very global and big scale. Now, when we make adjustments or accommodations in the workplace, it actually ends up helping everyone. Now, you're probably wondering, what's he calling an adjustment and what's he calling an accommodation? So I'm an occupational physician. Normally, when we talk about workplace accommodations, we fall into this zone of something really formal. You need medical documentation. You might have to take it to HR. And then there's some investigation or somebody comes and looks at the job site. Really a formal thing and lots of documentation. Adjustments, and that's fine. When you need that, we'll go through the process. Adjustment generally is an accommodation that's not as big a deal, right? So if the sunlight from the window is bothering you, you can adjust the positioning of your screen. You don't need to go file a report for that. You don't need a medical document for that. Perhaps using a noise elimination headset if you're not dealing with the public and you can just put them on. Maybe it's not something you need a formal accommodation for. So if there's little things that you can do in your workplace that don't need approval, those are what we call adjustments. Accommodations tend to be more documented. But when employers allow these things to happen, it actually helps not just the person needing the accommodation, but it helps everyone. Now, there's this whole discussion around should you disclose or shouldn't you? As you all know, legally in Canada, you do not need to disclose your health condition to your employer or, frankly, to anyone else unless you choose to. Now, whether you choose to or not really depends on the kind of disclosure it is. So, some people hide absolutely everything, other people are at the other end and they disclose everything. At the end, it's your choice on what you decide to disclose. Hopefully, you don't have to disclose your health condition, but you may have to disclose if you have a restriction or limitation or you need an accommodation. And how likely you're likely to disclose something is a lot based on your past experiences. Is your job changing? Is your condition changing? So this might be something to look at if you're wondering about what you should disclose. And this are comments on the same thing. I think I've covered that. And this is just more for supporting individuals. So one of the things that when we're supporting individuals to make accommodations or adjustments at work is to think about how you're going to do it, but then not just stop there. Is once an adjustment or accommodation is made, come back to keep reviewing it is what's meant here. Some language around if you have a coworker or you're the supervisor of someone with ADHD, some language around rather than assuming they have ADHD, how are you finding this? What supports or adjustments can we make? So there's some language around that. So I want to dive into, with the time that we have, on some specific strategies that can help with ADHD. So if you are someone with ADHD or you're working with someone with ADHD and they're struggling around time management, allowing time blocking. So setting up that do not disturb block, either a sign on the door if you're lucky enough to have an office with a door that shuts, or just blocks of time where you don't want to be disturbed. Having visual reminders of things that you're working on. Often people with ADHD will start to hyperfocus and then forget how long they've spent on this task, which is fine for that task, but then maybe another task is getting neglected. So having some timer or something that's going to remind them that they've already spent 15 or 20 minutes on something, and having visual reminders of things that they need to work on. Otherwise, it becomes an out of sight, out of mind. Supportive goal setting. So employers and other people that can help you set goals without micromanaging. If there's someone else in that organization that has struggled with similar things, maybe assigning them as a mentor. This whole body doubling thing is really cool. Again, not something we talked about before, but the idea with body doubling is two people that want to get something done, each do it, but they hold the other person accountable. They don't check on each other's work. So let's say me and Carissa need to do something. I need to plan a family holiday. She needs to organize her finances. We go to a coffee shop or go to a library. I work on my family holiday flights and hotels. She works on her finances. And then we commit that after 45 minutes, we'll take a break. Me just being there with Carissa, it holds her accountable, and her being there with me holds me accountable. We're not even sitting at the same table. Right? That's body doubling. And you can do that with workplaces and in your personal life as well. Organizational tools, and there's hundreds and thousands of these. So whether you're old school like me, paper planners, Post-it notes, big whiteboards, do whatever it takes, or you can get the digital reminders, right? The apps, the spreadsheets, the smartphones that beep and buzz and vibrate when you're supposed to do things. The takeaway there is find a system that works and stick to it. We're not expected to be the experts on everything. So if you're struggling, think about if you have a little bit of budget for professional development, think about instead of a workshop, maybe getting a couple of sessions with a coach. There are ADHD coaches that can really help you put systems in place where you can set goals, reach goals, and be organized. And I already talked about the checklist. The distractibility, think about those noise canceling headphones. And when we started this work 13 years ago, these things were crazy expensive, right? They were $300-400. Now you can get noise canceling headphones or earplugs or whatever, a really good pair for under $100, usually $70-80, and they work really well. Have quiet zones in parts of your physical space that where there isn't going to be any noise. A big mistake we made, I'm an occupational physician, so a big mistake we made in the 1970s and 80s was we moved to this open office concept. It does not work. It was an experiment that failed. We said, we're not going to have, my door is always going to be open. I'm not going to have a door. I'm not going to have walls. We're going to have everybody sitting at an open table. Well, yeah, it was meant to cross-fertilize discussions and interactions, but people didn't always do that. They sat with their headset, elbow to elbow touching, and didn't even say good morning to the person next to them, right? So, but for people with ADHD who get easily distracted, this open office concept is a nightmare because they're getting distracted by someone's click on the keyboard, somebody walking by, the chewing of gum. So for people with ADHD, if possible, and I appreciate in healthcare, you don't always have the luxury of an office because you're out with your clients and patient spaces and so forth. But if you have the luxury of getting your employer to work with you to have a workspace where you can do your charting and your writing that is quiet with some walls and a door that shuts, minutes. That often is an accommodation we advocate for. Flexible work arrangements, if it's possible, and it's not always possible because we're working with the public in healthcare, but if it's possible to adjust the work schedule, that it's when your ADHD medicine's working, or it's a time of the day where you know you're more alert and your focus is better than at other times of the day, see what you can do there. And also around where you're working, this whole concept of working from home versus having to go in. Again, I appreciate in healthcare, we have to go to where the client and the patient is. But if there was an opportunity to do some of that paperwork from other environments, figure out how that is. How we receive information. Just because someone's always sent it by email or someone's always given it verbally, that may not work for you. Think about what works for you. Some people prefer the verbal because they get impatient with the email not coming back or it's too formal. Other people prefer email or text because then it's in writing and they can see it and refer back to it. So think about that. Meetings. We all love meetings. Just kidding. We have to figure out, firstly, are the meetings important? Are they actually relevant? And does whoever's at the meeting need to be there? So first of all, optimizing those meetings. No meeting should be more than 40 minutes, right? 45 minutes. Because whether you have ADHD or not, your mind starts wandering. And so keeping meetings really short and giving everybody a break at 45 minutes is really important. And then, I don't know how we deviated from this, but having meetings where there's a clear agenda in advance isn't just good for the person with ADHD, but it's good for everyone because they can prepare then for it. And now with all the AI tools, you shouldn't have to take copious notes after. The AI tool should be able to provide minutes of the meeting afterwards, so you can then just focus on the meeting. And that's good for everyone, especially people with ADHD. People with ADHD and their impulsivity challenges, encouraging people to pause and think. Try not to have a workplace where people are just immediately spitting out things and you have to work and move really quickly, because that then leads to people saying things that are inappropriate or unprofessional, and then regretting what they did, right? And foster an environment where let's just calm down. We don't have to make a decision right now. We've got all the information we need. Let's make a decision tomorrow. Think about the mindfulness meditation sessions, the frequent breaks. Break down those bigger tasks into smaller, achievable goals. I have a friend that says, Gurdeep, if one more person, she has ADHD, she says, one more person says to me to take that big task and break it into small chunks, I'm going to throw the chunks, the big ones and the small ones at that person. And I appreciate it. Something we all say, but believe it or not, it works, right? So do think about taking that big, intimidating task and breaking it into little bits and just doing a little bit that day and putting it away after that. Before we finish up and open for questions, I just want to mention that there's another aspect to this, which is that we need to be really inclusive in our hiring. A lot of our way that we post positions, we interview candidates, we board people in, isn't ideal for people who are neurodivergent. And we really need to think about how we do interviews and all that sort of stuff. I won't bore you with the details here, but for managers to think about all that stuff. And if we have a workplace where we're implementing adjustments and accommodations, remember that we need to keep everybody involved and engaged and open communication. If a particular accommodation isn't working for someone, the staff put this one in because we had a patient with ADHD that had a hard time sitting down. So she needed the option of being able to stand at times and sit at times, not because of a physical condition like a back condition, which is normally why we ask for a sit-stand desk. But in her condition, for her, it was the ADHD, and she just needed to be able to change her position. So we got her a sit-stand desk. But just open communication for what you need. And sometimes those simple adjustments can be made. Monitoring the effectiveness of it. So not just putting it in and then walking away. You need to go back and revisit it. Is it still working? Because you change, your work changes, life changes. So you may need to revisit that. And I think I've said enough about this, but there are a lot of positives to having people with ADHD in the workplace. And like I said, the neurodiversity aspect of thinking differently, solving problems that other people can't. And I just want to mention the hyperfocusing. We often talk about ADHD and people with ADHD hyperfocus, and we often say it as a negative, right? Hyperfocusing at the exclusion of going to the washroom, getting up or eating is not necessarily a healthy thing. But on the other hand, if it's 1:00 right now and you have a deadline at 4, you have to get something in by 4, that person has ADHD and can hyperfocus, that they're going to get it done. In that 2 or 3 hours, the rest of us may not, but their ability to hyperfocus means that they'll probably get it done. But here's the key. So that's a huge benefit of having someone with ADHD who can hyperfocus in your workplace. But here's the problem with that. And please understand this. You cannot hyperfocus 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. That will lead to burnout. So hyperfocusing for little bits of time might work, but don't think that you're going to do it for a long period of time and stay healthy. It won't. It'll lead to burnout. I think I've said everything else there. Oh, last bit was around resources. So a super resource is this one at the top from CADEC. So CADEC is an advocacy group for people with ADHD, children and adults and family members. And they've got a really cool web page that has what the symptoms are of ADHD, what problems it's causing in the workplace, and then what accommodations you should think about asking your employer for. I like this because it's a bit of the you don't know what you don't know. And what I mean by this is you might not even think about asking for these things, but they've got a list of things you might want to ask for. And so do go to the links up there and look at those and say, I would benefit from that. I never thought I could ask for this. The Job Accommodation Network, our own ADHD center. So I hope we've been able to talk about ADHD and neurodiversity, some of the behaviors with ADHD, recognizing how it might manifest in the workplace, some of the strategies and approaches to supporting people with ADHD, what you can do as a manager or what you can take to your manager if they're not doing it already, and some of the resources there. I went a couple of minutes over, but that was a lot to cover. Hopefully you caught some of it. Delighted that we still got 170 people still here.
Yeah, and I see we do have some questions too, so maybe I'll just get started on those.
Sure.
Yeah, someone asked, what are some less typical or obvious signs of ADHD in childhood in girls?
Good question. So with girls, I'm going to go back to the symptom slide. Is that with girls, and you have to be very careful that we don't stereotype because boys can be like girls and girls can be like boys. But and the whole gender and transgender thing is that it's often not binary anyway, because we see a lot of people who are transgendered that have ADHD. Often, when you think about fidgety Phil, he's physical, he's hyperactive, he's falling off the chair, he's making farting sounds, and he's giggling. Let's call him John, right? So little Johnny's doing all that, and he's class clown. Jane, whose ADHD could be just as bad or worse, she is more likely, she could be all that too, but she is more likely to be daydreamy, absent-minded, and looking out the window, watching the leaf fall, watching the squirrel, watching the back of the teacher's head. So often her report card will say, Jane is a delight to have in the class. Everyone loves her, but she would do better academically if she focused a bit more. So little girls tend to be a little bit more on the absent-minded, daydreamy, zoning out, doodling. And that's why they get missed, because they weren't disrupting the teacher.
Awesome, I see lots of thank yous in the chat. And that this was helpful. It's awesome. Someone else asked, is stimming considered an ADHD manifestation or only associated with autism?
Great question. So stimming, just briefly, is when someone's doing some activity that helps soothe them, and so we do a lot of autism assessments in adults, and it's very commonly associated with autistic people. But people with ADHD can also stim, but they do it when their ADHD is not under good control, or they're often hyperactive, impulsive, restless. Whereas people who are autistic will do it all the time. Remember, autism isn't something that needs to be treated. That's just a different way of being. People with ADHD often are looking for treatment. So yes, you can stim as well with ADHD, but it's often because of the restlessness and hyperactivity not being fully managed.
Someone else asks, many of these expressions are exhibited in autistic individuals whom are also neurodivergent. Is comorbidity of ADHD associated with ASD very high?
Excellent question. So I don't use the word comorbid. Frankly,
Comorbidity.
yeah, I don't use the word comorbidity, frankly, because it's morbid. Just joking. I use the term coexisting. So yes, people with ADHD are more likely to be autistic, and autistic people are more likely to have ADHD. And that was one of the reasons we opened up the Autism Center just last year, because we were finding we had a lot of people coming in for their ADHD diagnosis, and we were pretty sure that they might also be autistic, and they were pretty sure they were pretty likely to be autistic. So yes, there is an overlap there. You're right. I had to smile. I used the Jane example, and someone says, "My name is Jane." Thank you. I didn't mean to identify you, although that's a great superpower I just had.
Someone else asked, can over-exercising, which you mentioned later, they asked if it can be a form of hyperactivity, and can peri/menopause impact ADHD symptoms and how?
Two awesome questions. We've got a very learned group here. So I'm going to go back to this picture of the brain. One sec. There we go. So you remember when I said that in ADHD, so I'll just pull back a bit since you asked my favorite question. So when you have one brain cell or neuron speaking to another neuron, they don't touch like this. So this one wants to talk to this one, and they're not touching. There's a gap. It's called a synapse. And a messenger has to go across that gap, right? So in people that are depressed, a messenger that's not going across enough is serotonin. So that's why a lot of people who get put on antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication, we're trying to increase their serotonin. It's what we call SSRIs. With ADHD, the two messengers that aren't going across enough is what I said earlier, are dopamine and norepinephrine. So with the medications, I'm just going to rattle some off here. Vyvanse, Concerta, Adderall XR, Fulquest, Bifentin, so Strattera. So I'm just rattling some off. I'm not saying anyone's better than another one. I'm just rattling some off. All those medications, guess what they do? It's not that complicated. They increase dopamine and they increase norepinephrine, so there's more messengers going across, okay? So to answer your question about exercise, guess what exercise does? Exercise, we all know, increases our endorphins. That makes us feel happy. But exercise also increases dopamine. Have you ever been on a treadmill or been out for a run or on an elliptical, and that problem that you couldn't solve, that was just nitpicking at you, all of a sudden you solved it, right? Like right at the end of exercise. If that's happened, it's because of the increase in dopamine helped your brain function better. So a joke I often tell patients, they're like, oh, Dr. Parra, my focus and attention is great when I'm working out. I'll be like, yeah, let's forget about my medications. Keep working out 24/7. Just kidding. We can't work out 24/7. Otherwise, that would be a great way to treat your ADHD. So exercise does help with dopamine, which will help your concentration and focus. It's just that often it's short-lived because you can't keep exercising. Your second question is super important. And the other Dr. Parhar has a whole 1 hour talk on ADHD and menopause and ADHD and menstrual cycles. What she will tell you is it's not just dopamine and norepinephrine that are a problem, but drops in estrogen, right? So if you're younger in age and you're having menstrual cycles, that 1 week when your estrogen level drops, we call it PMDD, PMS in the old way, in the old terms, when the hormone levels change and the estrogen drops, women will say to me, Dr. Parr, your medicine works great except for that 1 week. That 1 week, it's like I'm taking an M&M. And what's happening there is the estrogen level has dropped low, and that's affecting her concentration and focus. In menopause, and there's a way we can fix that. I adjust their medication just for that week. So don't fret. If that's an issue, we can address that. But for women in older life and around menopause, what's happening there is the estrogen levels dropping again. So we have seen a lot of women around menopause that they went their whole life. They have ADHD since they were born, but they were able to function. Then come perimenopause. Then the estrogen level drops, and then what they could get away with earlier, they can't get away with now because their concentration and focus isn't good. My best example is an accountant who ran this really complex accounting firm. And she was like, on top of it and so forth. And she says, Dr. Parr, I'm like 47 now and I can't even balance my own checkbook. Whereas before I was running my accounting firm. So yes, so menopause, we're seeing more people present with ADHD and in certain times of the month for younger women as well. Yeah.
There was another question here that maybe will pertain to a lot of people here. Someone said, does starting one task, then getting distracted by another email or thought or random thing, switching to that, then getting pulled away again by more thoughts or small interruptions, would that be considered ADHD?
Yeah, that is a symptom. So it's right here about distraction. Which one was it? So when you're sitting down to do something, and let's make it hard, something really boring. You got to do documentation for a patient encounter or something that you've got to do. And you have to do it, so you're going to do it, but it's not super exciting. And then an email notification pops up, or you get something on your phone that pops up. And so now you're like, oh, I should open that, and away you go. Right down that rabbit hole. Or a thought pops into your brain, right? All of a sudden you're thinking about, that was an awful thing that happened in the US yesterday. And now I should go look that up. Oh, I remember my friend had said something about this concert coming up next weekend. So you can get distracted by external stimuli, something that you see, or an internal stimulus that comes into your brain. And yes, that can be, if it's really, really problematic and you can't turn it off, can be a symptom of ADHD.
Someone said, I've seen the term AuDHD used. Is this term recognized or is it used as a diagnosis?
Oh, wow, you guys know everything. So when that question earlier about the overlap between autism and ADHD, so people that have both are calling themselves and if you look at this here, A little u DHD. So the AU stands for autism and the rest of it's ADHD. So here's the thing. It's not a real thing. So when you go into our book, which is the DSM-5, you won't see the term AUDHD. But here's the important part. People with ADHD can also have autism, and people with autism can also have ADHD, what I said earlier. And you might think, why is he saying that? Of course you can have both. But no, a few years ago, our book of diagnoses said you could not diagnose someone with both. They only had to, they could have one or the other. So now we're recognizing that people can have both. And we work with somebody who leads around a lot of initiatives around women with AUDHD. And we know it's not a real legal thing, but we know what she's saying is that someone who has both.
Someone asked, there are so many apps, but do you have a recommendation for a good ADHD lifestyle app for task management / organizing for chores, etc.?
Excellent question. So no, I don't have one particular one. And to be honest, I purposely don't have one because I think you can't use a cookie cutter approach. Everyone is different. Like I said, I'm old school. I still use Post-it notes, right? So at the end of the day, I think find one that works for you and be flexible enough to try a new one if you're bored of one.
Someone asked, maybe I'll do one or two more questions just to wrap up here. Is neurodiversity linked to workaholism? And can an ADHD person be a high performer in academics and have trouble in practical life?
Absolutely. So a lot of times people with ADHD, and we don't, I think I said it already, people with ADHD it's not that they're not successful. We see people because they're struggling, but a lot of people with ADHD, they figured it out. Right? They've set themselves up somewhere where their ADHD might even be an asset or their superpower, as some people call it. So yes, people with ADHD can work a lot. So here's a statistic you won't like. A friend of mine who's a psychiatrist in the Okanagan shared this with me. So it's his thing, his quote, Dr. Don Duncan. And what Don says, and he discloses he has ADHD. People with ADHD spend 4 times the effort to accomplish something that someone without ADHD is accomplishing. 4 times. Okay, just let that set in for a bit. That means that you're putting in 4 times the intensity, 4 times the time that someone without, right? So what does that mean? That's not sustainable, right? And so when you said workaholic, are they a workaholic because they're putting in more time and more intensity because it's taking them that much longer to get something done? Right. So yes, people with ADHD are often working harder, working longer. And if they're lucky, someone will catch that and say, hold it, this isn't quite right. And let's get this looked at. Otherwise, they could be seen as workaholic, but are they getting the results? Could they not just end their day at 4 or 5 and go home and relax or go to their family? And so it can be. What's the second part of that, Krista?
I was just saying, can they be a high performer in academics and have trouble in
Sorry, yeah,
practical life?
exactly. And you have to remember something. When we say ADHD, it's not always across life, right? So you can have people who are super successful in their work life. This one person I'm thinking about in particular, she runs an IT company, and so I said to her, "Oh, so I guess things aren't going well at work." And she goes, "I'm doing great at work," but she goes, "On the drive home, my tank is empty. I get home and I sit on the couch and I can't even flip the channel, change out of my clothes, make dinner, do anything with my partner." And she says, that tank is empty. So if you were to look just in her work environment, she's a superstar and things are going well, but they're not going well in other parts of her life, at home or other places. So you can have ADHD where someone is really good academically, but not so good at some of the clinical stuff. Or you get someone good at the clinical stuff and then not good at paperwork. I've got a patient who is a plumber and he's really good at solving problems like leaks and installations and providing service, but his company's about to go bankrupt because he always forgets to invoice. He doesn't do the paperwork. So you can get parts of even someone's functioning where they do well, but not well in others. So don't let that deceive you. When people look super successful, you really need to go under the surface to see, A, are they putting in lots of effort and they're risking for burnout to accomplish this? Or are other things suffering? Their health, their family life, other parts of their job suffering?